When my children told me my Sunday night phone calls were cluttering their busy lives and told me to learn to live alone, I didn't cry. I'm Myra Callahan, 68, a retired tax preparer from Western Oregon, and I'm about to show you what happens when a mother finally takes their advice, literally. The damp, moss-scented air of Coos Bay has a way of settling into your bones if you stay still for too long. For 34 years, I didn't have time to stay still. I sat at a small oak desk in the back of a local accounting firm, smelling of stale coffee and the sharp vinegar scent of old carbon paper, calculating tax write-offs for local crabbers and timber fallers. My fingers still carry a slight, permanent curve from decades of punching the keys of a heavy Monroe 10-key calculator. I raised Julian and Chloe in a modest cedar clapboard cottage nestled on 5 acres of old-growth Douglas fir, just where the coastal hills begin to fold back into the wilderness. My husband, Thomas, was a commercial fisherman. He went out past the bar on a stormy November morning when Chloe was 4, and his boat, the Sea Pelican, never came back. I didn't have the luxury of a long, theatrical grief. I had a mortgage, 2 toddlers, and a stack of medical bills from Julian's childhood asthma. I survived by doing what I do best. I balanced the ledger. I wore second-hand coats that smelled of someone else's lavender detergent. I ate the bruised apples the local grocer sold in brown paper bags for 50 cents a dozen, cutting out the soft spots to make applesauce while my children ate fresh grapes and roast chicken. I made a single gallon of milk stretch for a week by mixing it with powdered milk, shaking the plastic pitcher until my wrists ached. I did it because I believed, with a fierce, quiet certainty, that if I poured everything I had into their foundation, they would grow up to be my shelter when the winter of my life arrived. I know some of you are doing this exact math at your own kitchen table right now. You are skipping the dentist or driving a car with a slipping transmission, telling yourself that as long as your kids have what they need, the sacrifice is worth it. I want you to look closely at my kitchen table because it is the very place where that beautiful lie finally shattered. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in late October. The wind was whipping off the Pacific, rattling the loose pane in my kitchen window. I had just finished cooking a small pot of split pea soup, a recipe I still make out of habit, even though a single batch lasts me 4 days now. I sat down at the table, wiped my hands on a faded yellow dish towel, and picked up the beige corded landline phone. I still keep the landline. Cell service out in the timber is spotty, and besides, the physical weight of the receiver in my hand always made me feel connected to the world. I dialed Julian's number first. He lives in a sleek, glass-fronted condo in Portland's Pearl District, where he works as a lifestyle branding consultant, a job I've never quite understood, though I know it involves a lot of expensive leather shoes and black turtlenecks. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. He didn't say hello. "Mom," he sighed, and the sound of his breath through the receiver was heavy with an impatience that cut deeper than the coastal wind. "I'm in the middle of a dinner meeting. Is this an emergency?" "No, honey," I said softly, keeping my voice level. "I just wanted to hear your voice. I saw on the news that there was a bad accident on the I-5 corridor near your office, and I wanted to make sure—" "I'm fine, Mom." "I'm always fine," he interrupted. I could hear the clink of high-end silverware and the low hum of jazz music in the background. "Look, Chloe is on the other line. I'm going to merge her in so we can only do this once." Before I could reply, the line clicked. A second later, my daughter's voice filled my ear. Chloe is a high-producing real estate agent in Eugene. She married Todd, a man who wears salmon-colored golf shirts and speaks to waitstaff as if they are slow-witted. "Mom, is something wrong?" Chloe asked, her voice tight, vibrating with the frantic energy of someone who is always trying to sell a house to someone who can't quite afford it. "I'm prepping for an open house tomorrow. My assistant is literally standing in front of me with a stack of flyers." "Nothing is wrong, Chloe," I said. I pulled the yellow dish towel into my lap, my fingers tracing the frayed hem. "I just wanted to check on you both. It's been 3 weeks since—" "Mom, stop," Julian broke in. His voice had that smooth, patronizing tone he usually reserves for people who don't understand technology. "We need to talk about this. These constant phone calls. It's too much. Every Sunday, every Tuesday. It's like you're waiting by the phone for us to give you a reason to exist." "I'm your mother, Julian," I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I don't need a reason to check on my children. We have our own lives, Mom, Chloe chimed in, her tone sharp, clinical. Todd and I are trying to expand our firm. Julian is traveling to Seattle 3 times a week. We don't have the emotional bandwidth to manage your loneliness. You need to learn to live alone, find a book club, go to the senior center. But please stop calling us. We'll call you when we have time, which, realistically, won't be every week. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the faint, static hiss of the long-distance line. I looked down at my hands. They were spotted with age, the skin thin and translucent like parchment paper. I remembered holding Chloe's forehead when she had the chicken pox, staying awake for 48 hours straight, sponging her skin with oatmeal water so she wouldn't scar. I remembered driving Julian to his early morning swim practices in the dead of winter, the heater in my old station wagon broken, my toes going numb while I watched him splash in the heated pool. Learn to live alone, I repeated, the words tasting cold. Exactly, Julian said, sounding relieved that I had finally processed the data. It's about boundaries, Mom. Healthy boundaries. We love you, but we can't be your social life. We have to go. Okay, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't remind them of the thousands of dollars I had quietly funneled to Chloe for her down payment, or the way I had cleaned Julian's apartment when he went through his messy divorce 3 years ago. I understand. The line went dead. No, I love you. No, talk to you soon. Just a cold, electronic click. I sat there in the darkening kitchen for a long time. The split pea soup cooled in the pot, a thin skin forming over the top. I didn't turn on the overhead light. An hour later, there was a soft knock at my back door. It was Arthur, my neighbor from down the gravel road. Arthur is 70, a retired rural mail carrier who knows the name of every dog, child, and cedar tree in this county. He was holding a small wooden crate of late-season chanterelle mushrooms, his yellow slicker dripping water onto the porch. "Saw your lights were off, Myra," Arthur said, his voice a warm, gravelly rumble that always felt like a dry blanket. "Thought maybe you'd gone to bed early, but then I saw your car. You all right?" "I'm fine, Arthur," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He set the mushrooms on the counter and looked at me, his gray eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He's known me since Thomas died. He's the one who helped me patch the roof when a limb fell through it in '98, and the one who helped me haul Julian's old junk to the dump when he left for college. He didn't need me to tell him what had happened. He saw the cold pot of soup, the phone still sitting off its hook on the counter, and the look in my eyes. "They did it again, didn't they?" Arthur asked quietly, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "They told me to learn to live alone, Arthur," I said. I sat down opposite him. My voice didn't shake, but my chest felt incredibly hollow, like a dry well. "They told me my phone calls clutter their lives." Arthur let out a low, slow whistle, shaking his head. "Those kids of yours, they've got a lot of their father's pride in them, but none of his heart. Thomas would have walked through fire to hear his mother's voice for 5 minutes. They don't see me as a person anymore," I whispered, admitting the truth out loud for the very first time. "They see me as a monument to their past, something they've already moved on from, a chore, a line item on their monthly to-do list that they want to delete." "So, what are you going to do, Myra?" Arthur asked, leaning forward, his rough, calloused hands resting on the table. I looked at the old yellow dish towel. I looked at the green banker's lamp sitting on my desk in the corner, illuminating the neat stacks of folders I still kept from my few remaining local clients. For years, I had played the part of the doting, self-sacrificing mother who accepted their crumbs because I was afraid that if I demanded respect, I would lose them entirely. But sitting in that quiet kitchen, listening to the rain beat against the cedar shingles, a strange, cool clarity washed over me. If they wanted me to live alone, I would, but I would do it on my own terms. And they were about to find out that a woman who spent 34 years balancing tax ledgers knows exactly how to calculate the cost of a betrayal. I reached out and placed the phone receiver back on its cradle with a soft, decisive click. The next morning, the coastal fog was so thick I couldn't see the shoreline of the gravel road. It clung to the Douglas firs like wet wool, silent and heavy. I woke up at 5, just as I had every morning for 40 years. My joints gave their usual stiff protest as I sat up, but my mind was remarkably clear. For the first time in years, the heavy, anxious fluttering in my chest, the constant worry about whether my children were safe, whether they were happy, whether they would call, was entirely gone. In its place was a cool, empty space. I made a pot of black coffee using the old metal percolator that belonged to my mother. It makes a loud, rhythmic bubbling sound, a steady thrum, thrum, thrum that has always brought me comfort. I didn't turn on the television or radio. I just sat at the table with my mug, watching the gray light slowly filter through the kitchen window. If you've ever reached the point where you realize you've spent your life watering artificial flowers while your own garden withered, you know the quiet anger that comes with it. It isn't a screaming, throwing plates kind of anger. It's the kind that makes you sit very still, pull your shoulders back, and look at your life through a magnifying glass. Once my coffee was finished, I walked down the short, drafty hallway to the spare bedroom. It's a small room that smells of cedar and old paper. This was where I kept my professional life. In the corner sat my old desk and a heavy 4-drawer filing cabinet made of army green steel. I bought it at a school district surplus auction back in 1982 for $15. It has a dent on the bottom left drawer where a filing clerk must have kicked it, but the lock still works perfectly. I reached behind the faded framed print of the Oregon coast that hung on the wall and took down the small brass key resting on a nail. When you spend over 3 decades preparing taxes for loggers, fishermen, and small business owners, you learn one universal truth. People forget the promises they make in the light, but paper never forgets. I pulled open the second drawer. The metal rollers groaned, a sound that felt like an old friend greeting me. I began to pull out the manila folders, each one labeled in my neat, rounded print. I carried 3 specific folders back to the kitchen table. Let's talk about Chloe first. 5 years ago, she came to this house in tears. Her husband, Todd, had made a disastrous investment in a regional commercial development that went belly up, and they were on the verge of losing their personal home. She sat right where Arthur had sat the night before, sobbing into a paper napkin, telling me that her career in real estate would be ruined if they filed for bankruptcy. I didn't hesitate. I went to the bank, liquidated a portion of my modest retirement annuity, and handed her $85,000. But I didn't just write a check. I am a tax preparer, after all. I had Chloe sign a legally binding promissory note, secured by a junior deed of trust against her Eugene home. It carried a modest 4% interest rate, with a clause stating that the entire principal could be called due with a 90-day written notice if she defaulted on her quarterly interest payments. For the first 2 years, she made those small payments. Then, they slowly stopped. She offered excuses at first. Business was slow, Todd's truck needed a new transmission, and eventually she stopped mentioning it altogether, hoping I would forget. I had let it slide because she was my daughter, and I didn't want to cause tension. I looked at the promissory note now. The ink of her signature was bold and sweeping, the signature of a woman who was sure she would never have to pay her mother back. 90 days, I whispered to myself, my finger tracing the embossed notary seal on the bottom of the page. Then there was Julian. 3 years ago, when he went through his divorce, his credit was in tatters. He wanted to buy that sleek condo in Portland's Pearl District to maintain his image as a successful branding consultant. The bank wouldn't touch him without a substantial down payment and a co-signer. I didn't have the cash to give him, but I had equity in this 5-acre property. I agreed to co-sign the mortgage, and I put up 40% of the purchase price by taking out a home equity line of credit against my own land. We had signed a tenancy in common agreement. I structured it so that I owned a 40% undivided interest in his condo, and the agreement explicitly stated that if he failed to refinance the mortgage into his sole name within 3 years, I had the unilateral right to force the sale of the property to recover my equity. Julian's 3 years had expired 4 months ago. When I had gently reminded him of it over the summer, he had laughed and told me to stop stressing about the small stuff. I opened Julian's folder. There it was. The tenancy in common agreement, drafted by my old colleague Evelyn Vance, signed and recorded in Multnomah County. He had forgotten about the clause, or more likely, he had assumed I would never have the stomach to enforce it. He thought his mother was a soft, predictable creature who would always value his comfort over her own security. I know some of you are shaking your heads right now. You're thinking, Myra, how could you do that to your own flesh and blood? Let me ask you this. When was the last time they asked how you were paying your heating bill? When was the last time they offered to help you clean the gutters or check to see if you had enough groceries to last through a winter storm? They didn't see my sacrifices as love. They saw them as their birthright. They took my retirement, my equity, and my peace of mind, and then they told me my voice was clutter. At 10 o'clock, the back doorbell rang. It was Arthur. He was wearing his canvas work coat and holding a cardboard egg carton. "Brought you some farm eggs from down the road, Myra," he said, stepping inside and wiping his boots on the mat. He paused, his eyes falling on the neat stacks of folders, the yellow legal pad covered in my precise handwriting, and the calculator on the table. "You look like a woman on a mission." "I am, Arthur," I said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "I'm doing some accounting." Arthur sat down, his eyes scanning the documents. He didn't read them. He's too polite for that. But he knew what they represented. "You're going through with it, then? You're going to set those boundaries they talked so much about?" "They told me to learn to live alone," I said, sitting down opposite him. And they were right. But to live alone in this world, a woman my age needs her resources. I cannot afford to carry their debts anymore. Not emotionally, and certainly not financially. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked out the window at the fog-shrouded trees. "You know, Myra, when Thomas died, you could have sold this place. You could have moved back to the valley, found a nice, easy job, and let someone else worry about these 5 acres. But you stayed. You worked 12-hour days during tax season, eating canned soup so those kids could have music lessons and brand new shoes. I watched you do it. We all did. I don't regret the love I gave them, Arthur," I said, feeling a sudden sharp tightness in my throat. I looked down at my hands, wishing I could rub the ache out of my fingers. "But I regret teaching them that my love has no bottom. I regret letting them believe that they could step on me and expect me to apologize for being under their feet." "Well," Arthur said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his weathered face, "I'd say they're about to get a very expensive education." After Arthur left, I sat down at my desk and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Evelyn Vance answered on the second ring. Evelyn is 72 now, a fierce, sharp-witted attorney who has spent her career protecting the assets of local families in Coos County. She and I had worked together on dozens of estate plans over the decades. "Myra Callahan," Evelyn's voice boomed through the receiver, warm but businesslike. "I was just thinking about you the other day. How are those giant trees of yours?" "They're fine, Evelyn," I said, "but I need your help. I need to schedule an appointment. I have some files I need you to review." There was a brief pause on the line, the professional instinct in her instantly picking up on the tone of my voice. "Is everything all right, Myra? It's not your health, is it?" "My health is perfect," I said, looking at the promissory note and the tenancy in common agreement resting on my table. "But my patience has officially run out. I need to enforce some old agreements." "Bring them in tomorrow morning at 9, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into that quiet, steel-trap tone she uses when she's preparing for battle. "Let's see what we're working with." I hung up the phone. I felt a strange, cold thrill run through my veins. It was the same feeling I used to get when a client brought me a box of chaotic, disorganized receipts, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was going to find every single missing dollar. I spent the rest of the afternoon drafting the formal demand letters on my legal pad, making sure every date, every figure, and every clause was perfectly aligned. I calculated the outstanding interest Chloe owed me down to the penny. I calculated the exact balance of the home equity line of credit Julian was supposed to have paid off. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel vindictive. I just felt the heavy, undeniable weight of justice finally balancing itself out. As the sun began to set, casting a pale amber glow through the dissipating fog, I placed the papers back into their folders. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the towering Douglas firs. They had stood there for over a century, weathering the Pacific gales, deep-rooted and silent. They didn't ask the wind for permission to stand, and they didn't apologize for taking up space. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving the house in the quiet, peaceful dark, knowing that by this time tomorrow, the storm I was about to unleash would change everything. The drive into town the next morning was quiet. The windshield wipers on my old Subaru kept up a steady, rhythmic slap-slap against the heavy coastal drizzle. clearing away the pine needles that had drifted down from the overhanging boughs overnight. Coos Bay was just waking up. The harbor was a forest of crab boat masts shrouded in gray mist, and the smell of low tide and diesel exhaust hung heavy in the damp air. Evelyn Vance's office was located in a restored 1890s Victorian building near the docks. The stairs groaned under my boots as I walked up to the second floor, carrying my worn leather tote bag containing the 2 manila folders. Evelyn's office didn't have the sleek glass walls of the high-rise firms in Portland where Julian worked. It smelled of old paper, lemon wax, and the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke from the small cast-iron stove she kept in the corner. Evelyn was sitting behind a massive oak desk that was cluttered with thick legal treatises and cardboard files. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat, no-nonsense bun, and she wore a heavy green wool cardigan that looked like it had survived several decades of Oregon winters. She looked up as I entered, her sharp gray eyes softening just a fraction. "Myra," she said, rising to give me a brief, firm squeeze of my shoulder. "Sit down. Let me get you some tea." "Just black coffee if you have it, Evelyn," I said, setting my bag on the corner of her desk. "I need my wits about me today." She poured 2 mugs of strong, dark coffee from a thermal carafe and sat back down, leaning her elbows on her desk blotter. "All right, tell me what's going on. Your voice on the phone yesterday sounded like you were preparing for an audit of the soul." I didn't waste time with tears or dramatic complaints. I simply reached into my bag and laid out the 2 folders. I opened Chloe's first, smoothing out the creased edges of the promissory note. 5 years ago, I loaned Chloe and Todd $85,000 to save their house from foreclosure, I said, my voice steady, though my heart gave a small, familiar ache. I secured it with a junior deed of trust. They stopped making interest payments 36 months ago. I have the bank statements showing the last deposit was in October of 3 years ago. The contract states that if they default on interest, I have the right to call the entire principal due with 90 days written notice. Evelyn picked up the document, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. She scanned the pages, her thumb tracing the notary seal. "And you want to call the loan?" "I do," I said. "I want the full $85,000 plus the accrued interest at 4%, calculated from the date of their last payment. By my math, that's just over $17,000 in back interest alone." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, a slow, appreciative smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "That is a very clean, very painful trap, Myra. What about Julian?" I opened the second folder and slid the tenancy in common agreement across the desk. 3 years ago, I co-signed his mortgage for his Pearl District condo and put up 40% of the purchase price using a home equity line of credit on my own land. The agreement we signed, which you drafted for us, Evelyn, explicitly states he had 36 months to refinance the mortgage into his sole name and remove me from the debt. That deadline passed 4 months ago. He has ignored my reminders. Evelyn leaned back in her leather chair, the springs giving a loud, familiar creak. "The agreement gives you the unilateral right to force a partition sale of the condo to recover your 40% equity if he fails to refinance. Do you want me to file the petition for partition?" "I want you to send him a formal demand letter first," I said. "Give him 30 days to refinance and pay me my 40% share of the current market value, or we file the lawsuit to force the sale. I've already pulled the comparable sales for his building. A 2-bedroom condo in his stack sold last month for $620,000. My 40% share is roughly $248,000. Evelyn stared at me for a long moment, the silence in the room filled only with the soft patter of rain against the window pane. "You realize what this will do, Myra? They are going to be furious. They will accuse you of being cold, of being vindictive. They will say you are destroying their financial stability." "They told me to learn to live alone, Evelyn," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "They told me my presence in their lives was a chore. They wanted boundaries. I am simply giving them the most solid, legally binding boundaries available under Oregon law. If I am to live alone for the rest of my days, I will do it with my own money in my own bank account, not sitting in their luxury real estate." Evelyn let out a low, appreciative chuckle. "I've always loved working with tax preparers. You people know exactly where the bodies are buried, because you're the ones who helped dig the graves. I'll have the demand letters drafted, signed, and sent via certified mail by this afternoon." "Thank you, Evelyn," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Send them with return receipts requested. I want to know the exact minute they signed for them. Now I want to talk to you for a moment. Yes, you, sitting there thinking about that one phone call you made to your own child that went to voicemail, or the way they sighed when you asked if they were coming home for the holidays. I know how hard it is to hold your tongue. I know the desperate, clawing urge to explain yourself, to beg them to understand how much you sacrificed, how many nights you stayed awake worrying about them. But let me tell you a secret I learned at that oak desk in Coos Bay. Silence is the loudest sound you can make. When you stop chasing people, they are forced to stand still and realize how far you've already walked away. For the next 10 days, I practiced that silence. I went back to my cedar cottage and did exactly what my children had suggested. I lived my life. I woke up early, brewed my coffee, and walked down to the shoreline of the gravel road. I helped Arthur clean out his greenhouse, my hands covered in the rich, dark smell of damp soil and compost, as we prepped his winter starters. We didn't talk about my children. We talked about the weather, the price of propane, and the way the elk herd had started moving down from the high ridges early this year. You look peaceful, Myra, Arthur said one afternoon as we sat on his porch, drinking hot cider from a thermos, like a woman who's finally unloaded a heavy pack. I am Arthur, I said, watching a blue jay flit through the branches of a cedar tree. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending trying to keep a fire burning when the other people had already walked out of the room. The peace, of course, was the calm before the storm. On the 11th day, the green return receipt cards arrived in my mailbox. I held them in my hand, feeling the stiff, textured paper. One card was signed by Chloe in her frantic, messy handwriting. The other was signed by Julian's condo building concierge, but the tracking number confirmed it had been delivered directly to his unit. The trap was officially set. It took exactly 48 hours for the phone to start ringing. I was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for a blackberry pie, when the landline gave its sharp, mechanical trill. I looked at the caller ID. Julian Callahan. I didn't answer. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron, picked up my wooden rolling pin, and went back to my dough. The phone rang 10 times before it finally cut to the answering machine. Mom! Mom, are you there? Pick up! Julian's voice came through the small speaker, stripped of its usual smooth, professional polish. It sounded high-pitched, frantic, and laced with a cold undercurrent of panic. What the hell is this letter from Evelyn Vance? A partition action? Are you out of your mind? I can't refinance right now. Interest rates are double what they were when we bought this place. Call me back immediately. The machine beeped, and the house fell silent again. An hour later, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID read Eugene or Chloe. I didn't answer. I let the machine pick up. Mom, what is this? Chloe was practically screaming, her voice cracking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. A 90-day demand for $85,000 plus $17,000 in interest? Are you trying to ruin us? Todd is furious. We don't have that kind of cash sitting around. You told us that money was a gift. Call me right now, Mom. This isn't funny. I stood by the kitchen counter, my fingers gently crimping the edges of the pie crust. I felt a brief, passing shadow of the old motherly instinct, the urge to pick up the phone, to soothe them, to tell them we could work it out. But then I remembered the cold, clinical tone of Chloe's voice on that rainy Tuesday. We don't have the emotional bandwidth to manage your loneliness. Learn to live alone. They had wanted a mother who existed only as a convenient safety net, a silent bank account they could ignore until they needed a withdrawal. They didn't want my voice, but they certainly wanted my silence to remain free of charge. I put the pie in the oven, set the timer, and walked out onto the back porch. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth and salt. I sat down on the wooden bench, pulling my wool shawl tight around my shoulders, and listened to the wind rustling through the towering Douglas firs. For the first time in 34 years, I didn't feel the need to explain my choices to anyone. The silence was mine, and it was beautiful. The phone calls didn't stop, but they changed. They lost their polished, professional sheen and turned into something raw and ugly. By the third day after the return receipts came back, the voicemails left on my machine were a chaotic mix of fury, desperation, and old, manipulative tricks. Chloe tried the soft approach first. "Mommy, please!" Her voice had whimpered through the small plastic speaker of my machine, using a childhood name she hadn't uttered since she was 12. "Todd is talking about selling his grandfather's gold watch. We're going to lose our listing leverage if this goes to court. Can't we just sit down and talk? I love you." Then, when I didn't call back, the mask slipped. 12 hours later, she was screaming, "You selfish old woman! You're going to ruin my marriage. If you do this, you will never see your grandchildren again. Do you hear me? Never." I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea cooling between my palms, and listened to her voice echo in the quiet room. If you've ever had to lock your own heart against the children you carried in your body, you know the physical sickness that comes with it. Your stomach turns into a cold, heavy stone. You wonder where you went wrong, which scraped knee you didn't kiss well enough, which late-night fever you didn't soothe that made them turn out so hollow. But then I looked at the yellow legal pad sitting next to my tea. On it, I had written a single date, November 14th, 2021. That was the last time Chloe had brought her children to see me, and even then, she had only stayed for 45 minutes, complaining the entire time that my house smelled like old trees and that there was no high-speed internet for the kids. She had already taken my grandchildren away from me. She had just been using them as a carrot on a stick to keep me compliant. Julian's calls were different. They were cold, analytical, and full of legal bluster. He had his fancy Portland lawyer call Evelyn, but Evelyn had simply emailed back a copy of the signed tenancy in common agreement with a single sentence. "Our client is exercising her contractually guaranteed unilateral right." After that, Julian called me directly, his voice shaking with a rage he could barely contain. "You think you're being clever, Mom? You're going to force a sale of my home? In this market? I'll tie you up in litigation for the next 5 years. You don't have the money to fight me." He didn't understand. I didn't need to fight him. I had the paper. And as any retired tax preparer will tell you, a clean contract in front of a Coos County judge is like a sharp saw through soft cedar. It doesn't care about your feelings, it just cuts. I knew they would come. People who have spent their entire lives treating others like stepping stones don't accept a boundary written on a piece of legal stationery. They think that if they can just get in front of you, if they can look you in the eye and use the old, familiar leverage of your own guilt, you will crumble. They expect the mother who ate the bruised apples. They expect the woman who shook the powdered milk. So, I prepared. On Thursday, I hired a locksmith from North Bend, a quiet young man named Toby, who wore a flannel shirt and smelled of peppermint tobacco. He spent 3 hours replacing the 40-year-old brass lock cylinders on my front and back doors with heavy-duty commercial deadbolts. He handed me 3 shiny nickel-plated keys, their edges sharp and new. "These are restricted keys, Mrs. Callahan," Toby said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Nobody can duplicate them without your signature and a security code. You're safe as a bank now." "Thank you, Toby," I said, sliding the keys onto my ring. Next, I called Wayne Miller. Wayne is 65, a retired sergeant from the Coos County Sheriff's Department who now runs Sentinel Security, a small private firm that mostly watches over the commercial timber equipment up in the hills. Wayne's late wife, Sarah, had been one of my dearest friends. He was a man who understood the value of quiet order. When I told Wayne what was happening, he didn't ask a dozen prying questions. He just listened, his heavy jaw set, his gray eyes fixed on the distant tree line. "I know Julian and Chloe, Myra," Wayne said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I remember when they were kids. They've got their father's stubbornness, but they never learned his respect for the land or the people on it. You want me there?" "I do, Wayne," I said. "I don't want a scene. I just want my boundaries respected." "You got it," he said. "I'll have a car parked at the junction of your road starting tomorrow morning." The storm hit on Saturday. The wind came howling off the Pacific, driving sheets of gray, freezing rain against the cedar shingles of my cottage. The Douglas firs groaned, their massive branches swaying like dark giants in the mist. It was the kind of day where you want nothing more than to wrap yourself in a quilt and watch the fire crackle in the stove. At 10 o'clock, Arthur came over. He was carrying a fresh loaf of sourdough bread his sister had baked, wrapped in a clean white dish towel. "Thought you might want some company today, Myra," Arthur said, shedding his wet yellow slicker on the porch hook. The weather's turning nasty. I always welcome your company, Arthur, I said, setting the bread on the counter. Put the kettle on. I think we're going to have visitors soon. We didn't have to wait long. At 11:15, the sound of a high-end engine cut through the roar of the wind. I looked out the kitchen window. A sleek, dark gray Mercedes SUV, pristine and expensive, but now splattered with the thick yellow mud of my gravel road, pulled into the driveway. It parked crookedly, right across my small herb garden, crushing the dormant rosemary bushes I had spent 3 years cultivating. Julian got out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a black designer raincoat and leather boots that were entirely unsuited for the Oregon mud. He immediately slipped, his ankle twisting slightly as his shoe sank into the wet clay. A second later, the passenger door slammed and Chloe stepped out. She was wearing a cream-colored wool trench coat that must have cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her hair pulled into a frantic, wet bun. They walked up the porch steps, their heavy footsteps rattling the old floorboards. They didn't knock. I watched through the small glass pane of the front door as Julian reached out, grabbed the brass handle, and turned it. When the door didn't budge, he frowned, shoving his shoulder against the wood. He tried again, harder this time, the metal rattling in its housing. "Mom!" Chloe's voice screeched through the thick wood, competing with the wind. "Mom, open the door! We know you're in there! Your car is in the drive!" Julian reached under the rusted metal milk box next to the door, searching for the spare key I had kept there for 20 years. His fingers came up empty, covered in gray cobwebs and dust. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He began to pound on the door with the side of his fist, a rhythmic, violent sound that made the window pane rattle. "Mom, stop this ridiculous game," Julian yelled. "Open the door right now. We drove 4 hours in a gale to talk to you." I stood in the hallway, about 5 feet back from the door. Arthur stood just behind me, his arm resting on the doorframe, his face calm but alert. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. For a split second, the old motherly instinct rose up, the urge to unlock the door, to apologize, to tell them I was sorry for causing them stress. I had spent 34 years opening doors for them, cleaning up their messes, making sure they were warm and fed. But then I looked down at the shiny new keys in my hand. I remembered the cold, clinical finality of their voices on the phone. "We don't have the emotional bandwidth to manage your loneliness." If they didn't have the bandwidth for my love, they didn't get the benefit of my shelter. I didn't unlock the door. Instead, I stepped forward and opened the small wood-framed window next to the entryway, just wide enough for my voice to carry through the screen. "I am not opening the door, Julian," I said. My voice was surprisingly quiet, but it had a weight to it that made both of them freeze. Chloe pushed her face close to the screen, her eyes wide, her makeup smeared by the driving rain. "Mom! What are you doing? Have you completely lost your mind? Look at us, we're freezing. Todd is ready to file for a divorce because of that legal letter you sent. You have to retract it." "I am not retracting anything, Chloe," I said, looking at her through the mesh. "The terms are in the letter. You have 90 days. "Mom, this is financial suicide for me," Julian shouted, stepping up behind his sister. He was shivering, his expensive coat dark with rain. "If you force a partition sale, my credit is ruined. I'll lose the condo. Everything I've built in Portland depends on my image. You can't do this to your own son." "You should have thought about that before the 36 months expired, Julian," I said. "And you certainly should have thought about it before you told me my voice was cluttering your life." "That was a misunderstanding," Chloe cried, her voice cracking as she tried to reach through the screen, her fingers catching on the wire mesh. "We were stressed. We have busy lives, Mom. You're our mother. You're supposed to understand that. You're supposed to support us, not sue us." "I supported you for 34 years, I said, my voice steady, though my eyes stung with a sudden, hot wave of unshed tears. "I wore secondhand coats so you could have college tuition. I ate bruised fruit so you could have fresh food. I co-signed your debts, and I gave you my retirement. And when I called you because I was lonely in the winter, you told me to learn to live alone. So I am living alone. And to do that, I need my assets." Before Julian could scream another threat, a pair of headlights cut through the gray rain at the bottom of the driveway. Wayne Miller's white Ford F-150 security truck pulled up, its yellow overhead lights flashing silently in the gloom. The door opened, and Wayne stepped out into the rain. He was wearing his black security jacket, his heavy boots making a slow, deliberate crunching sound on the gravel. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man doing a job. "Julian, Chloe," Wayne said, his voice carrying easily over the wind as he walked up the porch steps. "It's been a while." Julian turned, his face tightening. "Wayne? What the hell are you doing here? This is family business. Get off the property." "Actually, son?" Wayne said, stopping at the top of the stairs and placing his gloved hands on his utility belt. "Your mother called me. She has a registered private property directive with my firm. You two are trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to get back in your vehicle and leave the premises." "Trespassing?" Chloe gasped, looking from Wayne to the window where I stood. "On our mother's property? Wayne? You've known us since we were kids. You can't do this." "I've known your mother longer," Wayne said quietly. "And I know she's asked you to leave. Now let's not make this difficult. I've already notified the county deputy that I'm conducting an escort. He's parked down at the highway junction. If you don't get in your car, I'll have him come up and handle it formally." Julian stared at Wayne, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at the heavy new lock on the door, then at me through the screen window, and finally at his sister's ruined cream coat. For the first time in his life, he realized that his status, his expensive shoes, and his slick branding vocabulary meant absolutely nothing in the face of a mother who had finally decided to balance her ledger. "You're dead to us, Mom," Julian spat, his voice trembling with a bitter, childish venom. "You hear me? You're dead to us." He turned on his heel, his leather shoes slipping in the mud again as he marched down the steps. Chloe stood on the porch for a second longer, her face pale, staring at me with a mixture of shock and hatred that I will never forget. "I hope you enjoy your empty house," she whispered, her voice cold. She turned and followed her brother, her high heels sinking deep into the mud with every step, leaving ruined, deep tracks in the clay. Wayne stood on the porch, watching them get back into the muddy Mercedes. The engine roared to life, the tires spinning and throwing wet gravel into the ferns as Julian backed down the driveway and disappeared into the gray fog. Wayne turned to me, tipping the brim of his wet hat. "You all right, Myra?" "I'm all right, Wayne," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I'll keep a car at the bottom of the road for the rest of the weekend just in case," he said. He gave Arthur a brief nod, then walked back down the steps into the rain. I closed the small window and locked it. The house was suddenly very quiet, save for the sound of the wind rattling the glass. I walked back into the kitchen, my knees suddenly feeling weak, and sat down at the table. Arthur walked over and set the warm loaf of sourdough bread in front of me, then reached out and placed his rough, calloused hand over my shaking ones. "You did the right thing, Myra," he said softly. I looked down at the table, at the yellow legal pad and the shiny new keys. The silence in the cottage was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a woman waiting for a phone call that would never come. It was the quiet, clean silence of a house that had been cleared of its clutter. The rain did what the rain always does in Western Oregon. It washed the mud away. By Sunday morning, the deep, ugly ruts Julian's Mercedes had gouged into my dormant rosemary bushes were smoothed over by the steady, quiet drizzle, leaving only a dark, flat scar in the clay. The 90 days specified in Chloe's demand letter went by like a slow-burning fuse. For the first month, the silence from Eugene was absolute, punctuated only by the occasional certified letter from her attorney trying to negotiate a settlement. They offered $40,000, then $50,000. Each time, Evelyn Vance rejected the offer within an hour, sending back a single-page response. "Our client requires the full balance plus accrued interest, or we proceed with the foreclosure sale of the property." In the end, they didn't lose their home, but they did lose their pride. Todd had to sell his beloved saltwater fishing boat, the one he used to brag about at country club dinners, and they had to take out a high-interest second mortgage from a private lender to satisfy the debt. On a cold, clear Tuesday in January, the wire transfer hit my account. $85,000 of principal plus $17,420 of accrued interest. I sat at my kitchen table, the morning sun casting a pale, weak light across the yellow wood, and looked at the receipt Evelyn had printed for me. It was just black ink on a white page, but to me, It looked like 34 years of skipped dentist visits, second-hand coats, and powdered milk finally being accounted for. Julian's battle took a little longer. He tried to hide behind his Portland lawyers, filing motions to delay the partition action, claiming that forcing a sale of his condo would cause him irreparable financial harm. But a tenancy in common agreement is a stubborn thing. At the preliminary hearing in Multnomah County, the judge looked at Julian's signature, looked at the expired 36-month deadline, and gave him 30 days to either buy out my 40% share or let the sheriff put the property on the market. Julian chose to refinance. To do it, he had to swallow a high interest rate and sign away a massive portion of his monthly income, but he kept his prestigious address. My share of the equity, $248,000, was wired to my local credit union the day before Valentine's Day. I want to stop here for a moment and speak directly to those of you who are still holding your breath, waiting for the part where I tell you I felt a grand, soaring sense of triumph. I know some of you are sitting at your own tables right now, carrying the heavy weight of a child's coldness, wishing you had the courage to do what I did. I want to be honest with you. I didn't pop a bottle of champagne. I didn't go out and buy a new car or a fancy wardrobe. That night, after Julian's money cleared, I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet cottage, and I wept. I cried until my chest ached and my throat was raw. I cried for the little boy who used to hold my hand when we walked down to the mailbox, and the little girl who used to let me brush her hair until it shone like copper. I cried because I had to become their creditor just to get them to see me as a human being. If you ever have to do what I did, please know this. The pain of setting a boundary doesn't mean the boundary is wrong. It just means you still have a heart. Your strength isn't in being numb. It's in feeling the grief of their betrayal and choosing to protect yourself anyway. When the spring finally came, the coastal hills turned a brilliant, shocking green. The wild rhododendrons bloomed pink and purple against the dark, towering trunks of the Douglas firs, and the air smelled of salt, wet earth, and growing things. With the money back in my possession, I did the things I had put off for 20 years. I didn't buy luxury. I bought peace of mind. I hired a local crew to replace the leaking cedar shingles on my roof, watching from the porch as they hauled up the fresh, fragrant wood. I bought a new, energy-efficient wood stove that didn't require me to split kindling every 3 hours to keep my joints from aching in the morning. And I put the rest of the money into a boring, secure certificate of deposit at the local credit union, ensuring that I would never, for the rest of my days, have to ask my children for a single dime to pay for my care. Arthur helped me plant a new herb garden to replace the one Julian had crushed. We spent a Saturday afternoon in April digging up the packed clay, mixing in rich, dark compost that smelled of old leaves and sea kelp. "You're standing a little taller these days, Myra," Arthur said, leaning on his shovel and wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. "My back doesn't hurt as much as it used to, Arthur," I said, patting down the soil around a new rosemary starter. "That's because you're not carrying 2 grown adults on it anymore," he said, his weathered face breaking into that warm, familiar smile. "A house can only hold so much weight before the foundation starts to crack. You just cleared out the attic." "I did," I said, looking out at the gravel road, "and the air is much better in here now." The silence between my children and me lasted for nearly a year. I didn't call them, and they didn't call me. I lived my life. I joined the local historical society, helping them catalog old tax maps from the early logging days. I spent my Sunday nights cooking small, simple meals, sometimes sharing them with Arthur on his porch while the sun sank into the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and plum. I learned to live alone, just as they had told me to. But I learned that living alone didn't have to mean being lonely. Then, shortly before Thanksgiving, a small white envelope appeared in my mailbox. The return address was in Eugene. It was Chloe's handwriting, not the frantic, messy scrawl of her angry voicemails, but a neat, measured script. Inside was a single, glossy photograph of my grandchildren, Leo and Maya, sitting on a wooden bench at a pumpkin patch. They looked taller, their faces losing the soft roundness of early childhood. On the back of the photo, Chloe had written a few short sentences. "Todd is working in Bend now. We had to downsize to a smaller house, but the kids like the new school. I'm sorry for the things I said on your porch. We are trying to find our footing. I hope you are warm. C. There was no request for money, no demand for an apology, just a quiet, tentative acknowledgement of a mother's existence, sent across a chasm of cold cash and hard boundaries. A few days later, I received an email from Julian. It was brief, mostly detailing his new business venture, but at the very end, he had written, "The condo is doing fine. The payments are tight, but I'm managing. I hope your winter is mild." I sat at my green banker's lamp, looking at the screen, and then at the photograph of my grandchildren resting against the wooden frame. I knew we would never be the kind of family you see in television commercials. The scars were too deep, the trust too fractured, and the ledger of our past too heavily marked with red ink. They had loved my sacrifices, but they had hated my dignity. But as I looked at Chloe's card, I felt a tiny, cool draft of air blow through a door that had been welded shut. I didn't open it wide. I didn't invite them back into the center of my life, and I certainly didn't offer to help them with their mortgages. But I didn't slam it shut either. I took out a piece of plain cream stationery and a fountain pen. I wrote a short, polite note to Chloe, telling her the kids looked beautiful and wishing her a peaceful holiday. I sent Julian a brief email telling him to keep his wood stove clean during the winter storms. I did it because I am still their mother, and because a balanced ledger doesn't require hatred to remain balanced. It just requires the truth. I walked out onto my back porch, the cool evening air carrying the sharp, clean scent of the ocean and the deep, silent strength of the Douglas firs. They had stood there for 100 years, deep-rooted and unyielding, weathering every storm that blew in from the sea. They didn't apologize for their size, and they didn't beg the wind to stop blowing. They simply stood their ground, trusting their roots to hold them upright through the dark. I pulled my wool shawl tight around my shoulders, took a deep, clear breath of the damp Oregon air, and smiled into the quiet night.